Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez had always prided himself on being tough. At 28, he had climbed the ranks quickly in the Navy, earning respect through his no-nonsense approach and unwavering discipline. His sharp jaw was set in a permanent scowl, and his dark eyes held the kind of intensity that made junior officers straighten their spines when he walked by. The Norfolk Naval Base buzzed with its usual morning activity. Sailors moved with purpose across the concrete grounds, their boots clicking in rhythm against the pavement. The September air carried the salty tang of the nearby ocean, mixed with the diesel fumes from the ships docked at the pier. Rodriguez strode through the main corridor of Building 42, his polished shoes echoing off the linoleum floors. He was already running late for the morning briefing, and his patience was wearing thin. The previous night had been another sleepless one, filled with paperwork and reports that seemed to multiply like rabbits in his office. As he rounded the corner near the commissary, he collided hard with someone coming from the opposite direction. The impact sent papers flying through the air like confetti, and he felt his coffee mug slip from his grasp, crashing to the floor with a sharp crack. "Watch where you're going!" Rodriguez barked, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the hallway. He looked down to see a young woman scrambling to gather the scattered documents. She was dressed in civilian clothes, a simple gray hoodie and jeans that had seen better days. Her brown hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. The woman didn't respond immediately, focused instead on collecting her papers. Rodriguez's irritation flared. Here was some careless civilian, probably a contractor or visitor, who had just cost him his morning coffee and made him even later than he already was. "I said watch it!" he snapped again, his voice growing louder. A few passing sailors turned to look, their expressions curious but wary. Everyone knew better than to get involved when Lieutenant Rodriguez was in one of his moods. The woman finally looked up, and Rodriguez caught a glimpse of tired green eyes that held something he couldn't quite place. But his anger was already building to a boiling point. "Are you deaf? I'm talking to you!" Rodriguez stepped closer, his presence looming over the crouched figure. "This is a military installation, not some playground where you can just wander around bumping into people." The woman stood slowly, clutching the papers against her chest. She was shorter than Rodriguez had expected, maybe 5'6", with a slight build that made her look almost fragile in the oversized hoodie. Her face was pale, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of exhaustion beyond simple tiredness. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't see you coming around the corner." Her soft-spoken apology only fueled Rodriguez's anger. He interpreted her quiet demeanor as disrespect, as if she wasn't taking the situation seriously enough. In his world, when a superior officer spoke, you responded with energy and attention. "Sorry doesn't clean up this mess?" He gestured angrily at the broken mug and spilled coffee that was now spreading across the floor. "And it doesn't make me any less late for my meeting. What are you even doing here? Where's your visitor's badge?" The woman's eyes darted around the hallway, which was starting to fill with more onlookers. She seemed to shrink further into herself, her shoulders hunching as if she was trying to disappear entirely. I have clearance," she stammered, reaching into her pocket with one hand while still clutching the papers with the other. "I just need to find—" "Clearance?" Rodriguez let out a harsh laugh. "Lady, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but civilians don't just get clearance to wander around a naval base without proper identification. And they certainly don't dress like they just rolled out of bed." The woman's hand was shaking slightly as she continued searching her pockets. A few of the papers slipped from her grasp again, fluttering back to the floor. Rodriguez watched with growing impatience as she bent to pick them up once more. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, then raised his voice again. "Security! We need security down here." The call echoed through the hallway, and Rodriguez could see the panic that flashed across the woman's face. She looked like a cornered animal, desperate and frightened, but instead of softening his approach, Rodriguez felt vindicated. Clearly, this person had no business being here. "Please," the woman said, her voice cracking slightly. "Just give me a second to find my ID. I know it's here somewhere." "A second?" Rodriguez's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Lady, you've already wasted 5 minutes of my time, 5 minutes I don't have because some people actually have important work to do around here." A small crowd had begun to gather at a respectful distance. Junior officers and enlisted personnel watched the scene unfold, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. Rodriguez was known for his tough demeanor, but this level of aggression toward what appeared to be a civilian contractor was unusual, even for him. The woman had found something in her pocket and was pulling out what looked like a military ID card. But her hands were shaking so badly now that she dropped it, the plastic card skittering across the floor. "Unbelievable," Rodriguez said, shaking his head. "Are you on something? Drugs? Alcohol? Because that would explain this whole pathetic display." The accusation hung in the air like a physical blow. The woman's face went even paler, if that was possible, and Rodriguez could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. But he was too caught up in his own righteous anger to recognize the signs of something deeper than simple clumsiness or disrespect. "I'm not," she started to say, but Rodriguez cut her off. "Save it. I've seen enough." He turned toward the approaching security personnel, 2 master-at-arms who were jogging down the hallway in response to his call. "We've got a situation here. Possible intruder, possibly under the influence of something. She claims to have clearance but can't produce proper identification." The security officers slowed their approach as they took in the scene. One of them, a seasoned petty officer named Jenkins, had worked base security for over a decade. He recognized Rodriguez immediately and knew the lieutenant's reputation for being demanding but fair. If Rodriguez said there was a problem, Jenkins was inclined to take it seriously. "What seems to be the issue, sir?" Jenkins asked, his hand resting casually near his radio. "This civilian," Rodriguez pointed at the woman who was now standing with her back pressed against the wall, "collided with me and then couldn't produce proper identification when asked. She's acting erratically, possibly impaired." Jenkins looked at the woman more carefully. She did appear distressed, but something about the situation felt off to him. In his experience, real troublemakers rarely looked quite so terrified and small. "Ma'am," Jenkins said in a calm, professional tone, "could you please show us some identification?" The woman nodded quickly and bent down to retrieve the card she had dropped. This time she managed to pick it up without dropping it again, though Rodriguez could see her hands were still trembling. She held out the ID card toward Jenkins, but Rodriguez was closer and snatched it from her fingers before the security officer could take it. He glanced at the card, expecting to see some kind of contractor badge or visitor pass that would confirm his suspicions about her having no business being there. What he saw instead made his blood run cold. The card was a standard military common access card, but it wasn't what he had expected at all. The name read Sarah Michelle Chen, and the rank designation made Rodriguez's stomach drop like a stone. But it was the unit information that made his hands begin to shake. There, in clear black letters, were 3 words that changed everything: Naval Special Warfare. Rodriguez stared at the card for what felt like an eternity, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Naval Special Warfare meant only one thing. This woman, this small, quiet woman he had been berating for the past 10 minutes, was a Navy SEAL. The realization hit him like a physical blow. SEALs were the elite of the elite, operators who underwent some of the most grueling training in the world. They were legends, warriors who carried out missions that most people would never even hear about. and he had just spent the better part of 10 minutes treating one like a common criminal. Rodriguez's eyes moved from the card to the woman's face, seeing her now in an entirely different light. The exhaustion in her eyes wasn't the result of a late-night partying or drug use. It was the bone-deep tiredness that came from months or years of intense operations. The way she had tried to make herself small and invisible wasn't disrespect. It was the behavior of someone who had learned to blend into the background, to observe without being noticed. And the shaking hands weren't from fear of being caught in some deception. They were trembling from something else entirely, something Rodriguez was beginning to understand with growing horror. He looked more closely at the woman, at Sarah Chen, and began to notice details he had missed in his anger. There was a slight pallor to her skin that went beyond simple tiredness. Her breathing was slightly irregular, and he could see a fine sheen of perspiration on her forehead despite the cool morning air. Rodriguez had seen these signs before, in his own men after particularly difficult deployments. The military had a name for it now: post-traumatic stress disorder. And he was beginning to suspect that he had just subjected someone who was clearly struggling with the after-effects of combat to exactly the kind of confrontational situation that could trigger a severe episode. The ID card felt heavy in his hands, like it weighed 100 pounds instead of a few grams of plastic. Rodriguez realized that everyone in the hallway was watching him now, waiting to see what he would do next. The security officers looked confused by his sudden silence, and the growing crowd of onlookers sensed that something significant had just happened. Rodriguez opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. How do you apologize for something like this? How do you take back 10 minutes of verbal abuse directed at someone who had probably sacrificed more for their country than he could even imagine? Sarah Chen was watching him now, and Rodriguez could see a mixture of emotions in her green eyes. There was still fear there, but also something else. A quiet dignity that had never left, even when he had been at his worst. "Lieutenant?" Jenkins prompted gently, still waiting for some explanation of what was happening. Rodriguez looked down at the card again, his mind racing. The date on it showed that it was current, and the security features looked authentic. There was no doubt about it. He had just made the biggest mistake of his military career. But as he stood there, holding the evidence of his catastrophic error in judgment, Rodriguez realized that this moment was about to become something much more significant than just a personal embarrassment. Because Sarah Chen was still standing there, still looking like she might collapse at any moment, and he had a responsibility to make this right. The question was whether it was already too late. Rodriguez's hand began to shake as he held Sarah Chen's military ID. The weight of his mistake crashed down on him like a collapsing building. Around him, the hallway had grown uncomfortably quiet, with dozens of eyes watching his every move. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, his voice barely above a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again, this time addressing Sarah with the respect her rank demanded. "Chief Petty Officer Chen, He stopped, realizing that any apology he could offer would sound pathetically inadequate. Sarah took a step forward, and Rodriguez instinctively handed her ID card back to her. As she reached for it, he noticed something that made his heart sink even further. Along her forearm, barely visible beneath the sleeve of her hoodie, were the edges of what looked like surgical scars. "It's okay," Sarah said quietly, tucking the card back into her pocket. Her voice was steadier now, but Rodriguez could hear the exhaustion in every syllable. "You didn't know." But Rodriguez knew that wasn't an excuse. Military bearing and respect for fellow service members wasn't supposed to depend on rank or unit designation. He had failed at the most basic level of military professionalism. Jenkins, the security officer, stepped forward with a confused expression. "Lieutenant, is everything all right here?" Rodriguez looked at the seasoned petty officer, then back at Sarah. He could see that she was waiting for his response, probably wondering if he was going to try to save face or own up to his mistake. In the span of a few seconds, Rodriguez made a decision that would change the course of his career. "Stand down, Jenkins," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying across the hallway. "There's no security issue here. Chief Petty Officer Chen is exactly where she's supposed to be." The announcement rippled through the crowd of onlookers. Rodriguez could hear whispered conversations starting up as people began to understand what had just happened. A Navy SEAL had been mistaken for an intruder, and not just by anyone, but by a lieutenant who should have known better. Jenkins nodded and motioned for his partner to follow him back down the hallway, but Rodriguez could see the questions in his eyes. This incident would be talked about within hours, and probably reach his commanding officer's desk before the day was over. As the immediate crowd began to disperse, Rodriguez found himself alone with Sarah in the hallway, standing next to the broken coffee mug and scattered papers that had started this whole disaster. "Chief Chen," Rodriguez began, then stopped himself. He had been about to launch into a formal apology, but looking at her face, he realized that what she needed wasn't military protocol. She needed human decency. "My name's Marcus," he said instead, extending his hand. "Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez. And I owe you the biggest apology of my life." Sarah looked at his outstretched hand for a moment before shaking it. Her grip was surprisingly firm, and Rodriguez could feel the calluses that spoke of years of hard training and harder missions. "Sarah," she replied simply, "and like I said, you didn't know." "That's not an excuse," Rodriguez said firmly. "I should have handled this differently from the beginning, regardless of who you were or what your background was. I was late, I was stressed, and I took it out on you. That's on me, not on your choice of clothing or the fact that you looked tired." Sarah gave him a small, sad smile. "You're not wrong about the tired part. I just got back from, well, let's just say I've been away for a while. I'm still adjusting to being back stateside." Rodriguez felt another stab of guilt. Deployment readjustment was something every service member dealt with, but for special operations personnel, the transition could be particularly challenging, and he had just made it exponentially worse. "How long have you been back?" he asked. 3 days, Sarah replied. She bent down to gather the papers that were still scattered on the floor, and Rodriguez quickly joined her, collecting the documents he could reach. As they worked together to clean up the mess, Rodriguez caught glimpses of the paperwork Sarah had been carrying. Most of it appeared to be medical forms and appointment schedules. There were also what looked like psychological evaluation reports, though Rodriguez tried not to read the details. "Are you getting the help you need?" Rodriguez asked carefully as they stood up with the collected papers. Sarah's expression became guarded. "I'm following all the required protocols for post-deployment processing," she said in a tone that suggested this was a rehearsed response. Rodriguez recognized the deflection immediately. He had heard similar responses from other returning personnel who were struggling but didn't want to admit it. The military culture still carried a stigma about seeking help for mental health issues, even though officially the policy had changed. "That's not what I asked," Rodriguez said gently. "I asked if you were getting the help you need." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she could trust him with an honest answer. Rodriguez waited patiently, understanding that whatever had happened to her overseas, it had left its mark. "It's complicated," Sarah finally said. "The transition back is always hard, but this time feels different." Rodriguez nodded, encouraging her to continue without pushing too hard. "I lost someone," Sarah continued, her voice becoming even quieter. "Someone on my team. And I keep thinking that if I had done something different, made a different call." She trailed off, staring down at the papers in her hands. Rodriguez felt his chest tighten. Survivor's guilt was common among combat veterans, but for special operations personnel who worked in small, tight-knit teams, the loss of a teammate could be devastating. "How long were you deployed?" Rodriguez asked. 14 months, Sarah replied. 3 different operations, back to back. I was supposed to have a rotation break after the second one, but they needed someone with my specific skill set for the third. Rodriguez whistled low. 14 months of continuous special operations deployment was brutal under the best circumstances, and if she had lost a teammate during that time, it explained a lot about her current condition. "What was your specialty?" he asked. "Explosive ordnance disposal and underwater demolition," Sarah replied. "I was the only female EOD specialist in the unit, so when they needed someone who could get into spaces the guys couldn't reach." She shrugged, as if volunteering for the most dangerous assignments was no big deal. Rodriguez stared at her with new understanding. EOD specialists had one of the most dangerous jobs in the military, dealing with improvised explosive devices and unexploded ordnance that could kill them instantly if they made the slightest mistake. The fact that she had been doing this work underwater and in confined spaces for over a year made her even more extraordinary. "Jesus," he breathed, "and I gave you grief about bumping into me in a hallway." Sarah actually smiled at that, a real smile that reached her eyes for the first time. "When you put it that way, it does seem a little ridiculous." They stood there for a moment, both of them processing the surreal nature of the situation. Rodriguez was beginning to understand that his encounter with Sarah was about much more than a simple case of mistaken identity. This was a moment that would define who he was as a leader and as a person. "Listen," Rodriguez said, "I know this might sound crazy coming from the guy who just spent 10 minutes treating you like a criminal, but would you like to get some coffee? Actual coffee, not the stuff I spilled all over the floor?" Sarah hesitated. "I don't know if that's such a good idea. I'm not exactly great company right now." "I'm not asking you to be great company," Rodriguez replied. "I'm asking you to let me buy you a cup of coffee and maybe talk to someone who understands what it's like to wear the uniform." Sarah looked at him carefully, clearly trying to judge his sincerity. Rodriguez could see the internal debate playing out in her expression, the part of her that wanted to isolate herself warring with the part that recognized she needed human connection. "There's a decent coffee shop just outside the main gate," Rodriguez continued. "It's quiet. They know how to mind their own business, and the coffee doesn't taste like it was filtered through a gym sock." Sarah laughed, a sound that surprised them both. "All right," she said, "but I should warn you, I'm not really good at small talk these days." "That's fine," Rodriguez replied. "I'm not really good at it either, especially after making an ass of myself in front of half the base." As they walked toward the exit, Rodriguez found himself stealing glances at Sarah. Now that he knew her background, he could see things he had missed before. The way she moved with precise efficiency, never wasting motion. The way her eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, cataloging potential threats and exits. The way she positioned herself to maintain situational awareness even in the middle of a casual conversation. These were the habits of someone who had spent months in hostile territory, where a moment of inattention could mean death. Rodriguez realized that Sarah wasn't just tired. She was hypervigilant, operating in a constant state of high alert that her nervous system hadn't yet learned to turn off. "How are you sleeping?" Rodriguez asked as they reached the main entrance to the building. Sarah gave him a sharp look. "Why do you ask?" "Because you look like someone who hasn't had a decent night's sleep in months," Rodriguez replied honestly. "And because I've seen that look before, in my own mirror after I came back from Iraq." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "You were deployed?" "2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan," Rodriguez confirmed. "Nothing like what you've been doing, but enough to know that the transition back isn't always easy." They stepped outside into the bright September sunlight, and Rodriguez watched as Sarah automatically put on a pair of sunglasses. He noticed that she continued to scan their surroundings even as they walked, her training so ingrained that it operated on autopilot. "The sleeping is the worst part," Sarah admitted as they made their way toward the base entrance. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back there. I keep hearing the explosion that killed Danny. That's my teammate who didn't make it home. I keep running through the scenario, thinking about what I could have done differently." Rodriguez nodded, understanding more than she probably realized. "Survivor's guilt?" "Among other things," Sarah replied. "The military shrinks have a whole list of technical terms for what's wrong with me. PTSD, anxiety disorder, survivor's guilt, adjustment disorder. It's like they're collecting the whole set." "Are you working with someone? A therapist?" Sarah gestured to the papers she was carrying. "That's where I was headed when we had our collision. Mandatory psychological evaluation and therapy sessions. 3 times a week until they decide I'm fit for duty again." "And how's that going?" Sarah was quiet for a moment as they approached the coffee shop Rodriguez had mentioned. It was a small, locally owned place that had been serving military personnel for decades. The owner was a veteran himself and had created an atmosphere where service members could relax without feeling judged or scrutinized. "Honestly," Sarah said, as Rodriguez held the door open for her, "I think I'm getting worse, not better. The more they want me to talk about what happened, the more real it becomes. Sometimes I think it would be easier to just forget the whole thing and move on." Rodriguez understood that sentiment all too well. The military approach to mental health treatment had improved significantly over the years, but it still wasn't always the right fit for every individual. Some people needed to process their experiences through conversation and therapy, while others needed time and space to heal in their own way. As they found a quiet table in the corner of the coffee shop, Rodriguez realized that his morning had taken a turn he never could have anticipated. An hour ago, he had been worried about being late for a routine briefing. Now he was sitting across from one of the most elite warriors in the world, someone who was struggling with the invisible wounds of war. And somehow, he had become responsible for helping her find her way back. The coffee shop was exactly as Rodriguez had promised, quiet, comfortable, and filled with the kind of understanding atmosphere that only came from a place where military personnel could truly relax. The owner, a grizzled former Marine named Pete, had taken one look at Sarah's demeanor and quietly delivered their coffee without the usual friendly chatter he was known for. Rodriguez watched Sarah wrap her hands around her coffee mug, noting how she held it like it was anchoring her to the present moment. Her eyes continued to dart toward the windows and exits, even though they were safely inside a familiar environment. "Tell me about Danny," Rodriguez said gently, settling back in his chair to show that he had all the time in the world. Sarah looked surprised by the direct question. Most people, including her therapists, tended to dance around the subject of her lost teammate. But Rodriguez had learned from his own experience that sometimes the most healing conversations happened when someone was willing to listen to the whole story, without judgment or time limits. "Danny Reeves," Sarah said, a small smile crossing her face for the first time since Rodriguez had met her. "He was from Texas, had this ridiculous accent that got thicker whenever he was nervous or excited. He'd been a SEAL for 8 years when I joined the team. And he was the one who convinced the others that having a woman on the squad wasn't going to be a liability." Rodriguez nodded encouragingly, recognizing the importance of letting her talk at her own pace. "He was the best underwater navigator I ever worked with," Sarah continued. "Could find his way through underwater cave systems in complete darkness using nothing but touch and instinct. The guys used to joke that he was part dolphin." "How long did you work together?" Rodriguez asked. 3 years. We did 12 operations together before—" Sarah trailed off, her grip tightening on her coffee mug. "Before the last one," Rodriguez finished gently. Sarah nodded, taking a shaky breath. "It was supposed to be a routine demolition job. We were tasked with destroying a cache of weapons and explosives that intelligence said was being stored in an underwater cave system, the kind of thing we'd done dozens of times before." Rodriguez could see that telling this story was difficult for Sarah, but he also sensed that she needed to get it out. Sometimes the weight of carrying a story alone was heavier than the story itself. "We went in at night," Sarah continued. "Danny and I were the primary team, with two others providing overwatch from the surface. The cave system was more complex than our briefings had indicated, with multiple chambers and passages. We should have aborted when we realized the intel was incomplete, but you were professionals, and professionals complete the mission," Rodriguez said, understanding the mindset that drove special operations personnel to push forward even when conditions weren't ideal. "Exactly. We found the weapons cache in the third chamber, just like intelligence said we would. I was setting the charges while Danny secured the area. Everything was going according to plan." Sarah's voice became quieter, and Rodriguez had to lean forward to hear her. "The explosion came from the second chamber behind us. Someone had booby-trapped the entrance we came through. The blast brought down half the cave ceiling, and the water filled with debris and silt. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything except the sound of water rushing and rocks falling." Rodriguez felt his chest tighten as he imagined the scenario. Being trapped underwater in a collapsing cave system was the stuff of nightmares for anyone. But for someone whose job required them to work in such environments, it would be particularly traumatic. "When the debris settled, I found Danny pinned under a boulder near the cave entrance. He was unconscious, probably from hitting his head, when the explosion knocked him into the cave wall. I tried to move the boulder, but it was too heavy. I tried to clear the smaller rocks from around him, but every time I moved something, more debris would shift." Sarah paused, staring down into her coffee as if the answers to her guilt might be floating there. "I had maybe 10 minutes of air left in my tank," she continued. "Danny's regulator had been damaged in the explosion, so he was sharing my air supply through the emergency system. I had to make a choice, stay and try to free him, knowing we'd both probably die when the air ran out, or surface and get help." Rodriguez could see where this was going, and his heart ached for the impossible decision Sarah had been forced to make. "I chose to surface," Sarah said, her voice barely audible now. "I told myself it was the right tactical decision. Get help, come back with proper equipment, save them both. But when we returned with the rescue team 20 minutes later, Danny was gone. The emergency air system had failed, and he'd drowned while I was calling for backup." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of survivors' guilt and the terrible mathematics of life-or-death decisions. Rodriguez had seen enough combat to know that sometimes there were no good choices, only impossible ones. "Sarah," Rodriguez said carefully, "you know that wasn't your fault, right?" Sarah looked up at him with eyes that held depths of pain Rodriguez couldn't fully comprehend. "Do I? Because I've run that scenario through my head about 1,000 times since it happened, and I keep coming back to the same question. What if I had stayed? What if I had tried harder to move that boulder? What if I had given him all my remaining air and tried to hold my breath long enough to get help?" "Then you'd both be dead," Rodriguez replied firmly, "and the military would have lost 2 highly trained specialists instead of 1. "Maybe," Sarah said, "but at least I wouldn't have to live with the knowledge that I left him there." Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, understanding now why Sarah was struggling so much with her return home. Survivor's guilt was one of the most difficult aspects of combat trauma to overcome, because it was rooted in love and loyalty rather than fear or anger. "Can I tell you something?" Rodriguez asked. "About my second deployment to Iraq?" Sarah nodded, seeming grateful for the shift away from her own story. "I lost a soldier under my command," Rodriguez began. "Kid named Jimmy Torres, 19 years old, from Phoenix. He'd been in country for about 6 months when we got hit by an IED during what should have been a routine patrol." Rodriguez paused, remembering the weight of that day. "The blast flipped our Humvee and knocked me unconscious. When I came to, the vehicle was on fire and Jimmy was trapped in the back seat. I could hear him calling for help, but my leg was broken and I couldn't move fast enough to reach him before the ammunition started cooking off." Sarah was listening intently now. understanding that Rodriguez was sharing something deeply personal. "Other members of my squad pulled me clear of the vehicle just before it exploded completely," Rodriguez continued. "Jimmy died in that fire while I was being carried to safety. For months afterward, I tortured myself with the same kinds of questions you're asking. What if I had been faster? What if I had positioned the vehicle differently? What if I had been the one in the back seat instead of Jimmy?" "How did you get past it?" Sarah asked. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not sure I ever completely got past it," he admitted. "But I eventually realized that honoring Jimmy's memory meant more than just carrying guilt about his death. It meant using the experience to become a better leader, to make decisions that would protect other soldiers in the future." Sarah absorbed this, turning the concept over in her mind. "The thing is," Rodriguez continued, "you can't save everyone. And the people who are drawn to jobs like ours, special operations, leadership positions, high-stakes situations, we're the kind of people who have trouble accepting that truth. We want to believe that if we're just good enough, fast enough, smart enough, we can control the outcome of every situation." "But we can't," Sarah said quietly. "No, we can't. And learning to live with that reality is part of what makes us effective in these roles. Because if we're paralyzed by the fear of making the wrong decision, we become useless to the people who are counting on us." Rodriguez could see that Sarah was processing his words, but he also knew that understanding something intellectually was very different from accepting it emotionally. "The therapists keep telling me that I need to forgive myself," Sarah said, "but I don't even know what that means. How do you forgive yourself for surviving when someone better than you didn't?" "Who says Danny was better than you?" Rodriguez asked sharply. Sarah looked startled by the question. "He was more experienced, more skilled." "Sarah, you're a Navy SEAL," Rodriguez interrupted. "Do you have any idea how extraordinary that is? Do you know what the graduation rate is for SEAL training?" Sarah shrugged uncomfortably. "About 20%, Rodriguez continued. "And for women, the numbers are even lower because until recently, the program wasn't even open to female candidates." "You didn't stumble into this job by accident. You earned it through talent, determination, and abilities that most people can't even imagine." Rodriguez leaned forward, making sure Sarah was really hearing him. "Danny was a good SEAL, I'm sure, but so are you. And the fact that you survived doesn't make you less worthy. It makes you responsible for carrying on the mission." Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring out the window of the coffee shop at the ordinary civilian world going about its daily business. Rodriguez could almost see the internal battle playing out in her expression. "I don't know if I can go back," Sarah finally said. "Every time I think about suiting up again, about going underwater, I panic. What if I freeze up? What if I make another bad decision and get someone else killed?" Rodriguez understood this fear as well. The confidence that made elite warriors effective could be shattered by traumatic experiences, leaving them questioning everything they thought they knew about themselves. "Maybe you don't need to go back," Rodriguez said. "At least not right away. Maybe what you need is to find a different way to serve, at least temporarily." Sarah looked at him questioningly. "What if I told you that there was a way to use your skills and experience to help other people who are going through what you're going through?" Rodriguez asked. "What if there was a way to honor Danny's memory by making sure other service members don't have to face their demons alone?" Rodriguez had been thinking about this idea throughout their conversation. Sarah's combination of elite training and recent trauma made her uniquely qualified to understand and help other returning veterans who were struggling with similar issues. "The base has a peer support program for returning personnel," Rodriguez explained. "Veterans helping veterans deal with the transition back to civilian life or stateside duty. They're always looking for people who have real experience, who can relate to what other soldiers are going through." Sarah considered this, and Rodriguez could see a spark of interest in her eyes for the first time since they'd started talking. "You think I could help other people when I can't even help myself?" Sarah asked. "I think helping other people might be exactly how you help yourself," Rodriguez replied. "Sometimes we can see solutions for others that we can't see for ourselves. And sometimes the act of service, of focusing on something beyond our own pain, is what allows us to begin healing." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both of them processing the weight of their conversation. Rodriguez realized that his encounter with Sarah had changed him as well. He had started the day as a demanding, impatient officer focused on his own problems and schedule. But meeting Sarah had reminded him of the real purpose of military service, taking care of the people who serve alongside you. "Marcus," Sarah said finally, using his first name for the second time, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When you first saw me in that hallway, when you were yelling at me and treating me like I was some kind of criminal, did you ever imagine we'd end up here?" Rodriguez laughed, a sound that held equal parts embarrassment and amazement. "Not in a million years. If someone had told me this morning that I'd spend my lunch hour having the most meaningful conversation I've had in months with a Navy SEAL I initially mistook for an intruder, I'd have recommended they seek mental health treatment." Sarah smiled, and Rodriguez could see that some of the weight she'd been carrying seemed to have lifted, at least temporarily. "Thank you," Sarah said simply, "for listening, for sharing your own story, for not treating me like I'm broken." "You're not broken," Rodriguez said firmly. "You're wounded, and that's completely different. Wounds heal, especially when people have the right support and the right purpose." As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Rodriguez realized that this encounter had created an obligation for both of them. Sarah needed continued support and a path forward, and Rodriguez needed to follow through on the commitment he had made to help her find it. "Can I walk you back to your appointment?" Rodriguez offered. Sarah checked her watch and nodded. "Actually, that would be good. I'm supposed to be there in 15 minutes. As they walked back toward the base, Rodriguez found himself thinking about the strange turns life could take. This morning's collision had been an accident, but everything that followed had been a choice. His choice to take responsibility for his mistake, Sarah's choice to trust him with her story, both of their choices to see this encounter as an opportunity rather than a disaster. "Sarah," Rodriguez said as they approached the medical building where her appointment was scheduled, "I want you to know that this conversation doesn't end here. I meant what I said about the peer support program, and I meant what I said about not being alone in this." Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked like the warrior she was. Not broken or defeated, but someone who had been tested by fire and emerged with wisdom and strength. "I'd like that," Sarah said. "And Marcus, next time you're running late for a meeting and you bump into someone in the hallway?" Rodriguez grinned, knowing what was coming. "Maybe start with 'excuse me' instead of 'watch where you're going,'" Sarah finished with a smile that transformed her entire face. Rodriguez laughed and extended his hand for a final handshake. "Deal. And Sarah, Danny would be proud of you." As Rodriguez watched Sarah walk into the medical building, he realized that his morning collision had taught him something fundamental about leadership and about life. Sometimes the most important moments weren't the ones you planned for. They were the ones that happened when you were brave enough to acknowledge your mistakes and human enough to see the person standing in front of you. Rodriguez headed back to his office, knowing that he had reports to write and meetings to attend. But he also knew that he would be making some calls that afternoon to the peer support program coordinator, to his commanding officer about policy changes, and to Sarah Chen, to make sure she knew that her service and her sacrifice mattered. Sometimes redemption came in the form of grand gestures and dramatic moments, but sometimes it came in the form of a conversation over coffee and the simple recognition that everyone fighting their own battles deserved to be seen, heard, and supported. For Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez and Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, it had been the kind of morning that reminded them both why they had chosen to serve in the first place.